Wow, what a day. This beautiful bit of terra firma we're standing in here is at Kyogle on the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales, about an hour and a half from the Gold Coast, which is where the guys from Larry Australia, who look after now Beta Motorcycles Australia, look after the distribution of these Italian Beta motorcycles. So haven't ridden Betas for quite a while actually, and really significant that we've come out here today because they're launching the 2020 models, which are just arriving into the country. And significant in that these things are, you know, I think there's something like 85% of new parts across 2- and 4-stroke models, 4 2-stroke models, 4-stroke models, they're new generation. So really kind of fortuitous we had the opportunity to come out here and give these things a crack. You know, these things have got amazing component quality throughout. I'm not going to list all that now, but we're going to have a bunch of things on the website that'll sort of take you through that in more detail. But just to give you, I guess, a bit of an overview of what these new generation models are, why they're calling them new generation, and what's the sort of standout features of the thing. So, you know, I guess let's sort of start from the obvious stuff, you know, the bodywork. The bodywork is completely new. If you have a look at a picture of the 2020 models versus the 19, is radically different. You know, they're super stylish, really a lot of focus on making the, you know, we've got a really sort of slimline seat here. You can't see there's not a lot of depth in that. Shrouds are much more seamless. A lot sort of slicker look, so it's a radically looking different bike. The seat, as I said, is a little bit flatter. It's a lot easier to get forward in the saddle, and that's been the sort of focus on the ergo changes. Slimmer through the rear. So I guess, you know, plastics aside, the other big things is, you know, there's quite a significant change in the tank. You've got another litre on both 2- and 4-stroke this year. I think you've got 9.1 litres in the 4-stroke and 9.5 litres down the 2-stroke, just to give you that sort of fuel range. The frame now actually dips down quite significantly rather than running from the steering head to the top shock in a straight line. There's a really pronounced sort of like dip in the thing, which allows them to change the shape of that. And I guess the other really sort of standout thing from an ergo's point of view is the subframe. Beta has for many years had that polyamide, or I think they call it a techno plastic subframe, but basically a reinforced hard plastic. Benefit of that is that they'll be able to integrate, and it's a lot neater this year, they'll be able to integrate all of the electrics into it, also all the air box components and the air filter, and also some sort of new grab handles and license holders, etc. So radically different looking, feeling bike. You know, moving on to the chassis, which is another big change, and that's really significant. Big things really, aside from the different shape of it, they've created 15% more torsional rigidity in the frame, just for that sort of high-speed stability. That's been coupled with a 1 degree steeper steering head on the thing, and also the things are 20 millimeters narrower between your feet at the footrest, which is actually pretty significant. But just coming back to the steering head, and I think that's a really sort of interesting thing, because when you're moving a steering head by a degree, it might not sound like a lot, but it is, and it sort of changes the character of these bikes big time. The idea fundamentally being is because you've moved the crank in the 4-strokes. I'll come to the detail in a moment, but the crank has been moved back about 20 mil, which is massive in design terms. Swing arm's the best part of 10 millimeters longer. So as a result of that, to make sure you've got the same sort of weight on the front, they've actually brought the steering head in a degree to keep that weight bias the way they want it to. Let's move on to the engine. The 125, which is down here, it's an amazing little thing. That's got a whole lot of upgrades, everything from cylinder to expansion chamber to power valve to exhaust, you name it, clutch. That's got a lot of upgrades for this year, and it's a great little jigger. Takes a while. It's an acquired taste to get, you know, especially as you're getting a bit older, to ride a 125. It doesn't have the the oil injection or the electric start of the bigger models. Then the 200 this year, well, 200 was introduced last year as a new model, the RR200. That hasn't got, well, it's obviously got all the shared upgrades with the bodywork and chassis, etc. But the only difference being is the 10 millimeters longer swing arm, which the 250, 350 cousins got last year. And then the 250 and 350, big news is they've got a counterbalancer. Interestingly, a lot of people are going to say that they just sort of followed KTM and Husqvarna into battle, who did that, you know, a few years ago with their counterbalancer engine. You know, the Beta engineers actually made provision for that counterbalancer in that 250-300 two-stroke engine several years ago, I think in 2013. So why they didn't fit it before, I'm not quite sure, but they fitted it now, and that reduces vibration drastically in those two-stroke engines. I think though, you know, when you're talking about this 2020 range, you know, I think what headlines the changes to the thing is the 4-strokes, you know. Worldwide, Beta sells 65-35, 2-strokes to 4-strokes. Here in Australia, it's even a bigger differential, so I think it's 75-25, but they're looking to redress that, and I think they realise that there's a really big opportunity by releasing, well, not only retaining their 4-stroke models, the 350, 390, 430, 480, which all have really, really different personalities, but by making really radical changes. They're not just a tweak to the parts, they are genuinely new engines. I mean, we're talking about, you know, the crank is moved back 20 millimeters toward the dynamic fulcrum point that we call it. They said they're moving it back toward the swing arm pivot. makes huge changes. It has huge implications. You can visibly see how much higher the axis of the clutch shaft sits in the frame. And the significance of that is not only that they've managed to find more power and rideability out of the bikes, but by centralising the mass, you are minimising the engine's effect on the bike's handling. You're just creating a much more neutral bike, neutral handling, and that was really evident, on these 4-strokes today. Like I said, we're going to go into each of the capacities for both 2-stroke and 4-stroke in a little bit more detail, but just sort of staying, I guess, on the big picture. Probably fair to say that Beta's always been known as a really hard-nosed bike in terms of its aggressive, lightweight, hard-nosed enduro bike. But the one thing that sort of has let the thing down for faster riders anyway, it's been great for trail riders, has been suspension. Last year they moved from the Sachs to the Sachs ZF suspension, some up-spec. Made improvements, but not as much as a lot of people or the faster guys were demanding. This year, some pretty significant changes to that ZF fork. 48mm upside down open cartridge fork. A lot of internal changes, but the long and the short of it is it sits up in the stroke much better. It's much more progressive throughout the stroke. It works well with a slightly steeper steering angle, and it creates a much better front to rear balance in the bike. There's also been quite a significant upgrades in the shock absorber as well. So just talking about performance, well, like I said, we'll go into more detail on each of the bikes a bit later, but I think the biggest standout for me, from previous model Betas, was the fact that the suspension is really now up to speed with the rest of the bike, which is, world class. I mean, you've seen these guys have won, they've locked out the World Enduro Championship in the E1 and E3 class for about 3 years. They won the thing outright with Steve Holcomb and then Brad Freeman joining the party this year. So, I think that R&D that they've done on that world stage has actually just created some, made these things really cutting edge, and they've stepped forward a big way. We had 8 bikes to ride today. We're pretty buggered. There's been a fantastic trail loop that we've been out here, and it's had a whole lot of everything. A lot of bumpy stuff, a lot of rocky creek beds, some beautiful grass track, some really challenging, they had a poker run out here recently, so some really challenging sort of tracks that have had a lot of traffic, and it was a really good test of the bikes. Standout stuff for me, really, I think the 4-strokes. We always know that the 2-stroke's been an amazing engine, and the suspension's finally caught up on the thing. 250 and 300 are really rideable. 200 was a standout, I think, for a lot of people today in terms of the 2-stroke. It was, it punches above its weight. It's got the torque of a bloody, feels like the torque of a 250, and is a really incredible thing. And as I understand, has already, just a year in from its existence, been a really good seller. I love the 4-strokes today, and I love the fact that, a lot of people will look at it on paper and say 350, 390, 430, 480, like, hey, aren't all those models stepping on each other's toes? But I think once you ride the things, you realise that they don't. The difference between the 350 and the 390, the 390 is a longer stroke, so it lugs a little bit more. Both incredible machines. The difference between the 430 and the 480, interestingly, is they don't change the stroke. They retain the same stroke, but they move to a bigger piston. I think it's a 100mm piston from a 95 on the 480. But, I think it's been a design brief that these things are super rideable, super user-friendly. But, these things, what really stood out in terms of the balance of the chassis, being able to handle those, downhill braking, off camber, up hills, change of direction was really standout. I thought the tractability and the fun factor of all the bikes was kind of next level. I think these things are definitely in the market now with any other bike out of Europe or Japan, for that matter. And I think probably, you can't have that conversation without having a look at the price of the things. And depending on the model, they're anywhere between, I think, to be fair, Sherco, Gas are also significantly below where sort of KTM and Husky are these days. But looking at the Betas, they're along those lines, and they're anywhere between sort of 800 and 1600 cheaper than the equivalent model in KTM. But look, these things are much more versatile than they have been in previous years, largely due to the up-spec suspension. What they've done to the changes of the centralising the mass, the bodywork, and all the little detail changes, like collectively made things, really on point. We had an absolute ball riding these things today. Nothing broke, nothing fell off the things. I think Beta's actually made a name for itself for actually having really robust bikes. It'd be interesting to put them on the scales. I think they're a little bit sort of heavier than some of the lightest things in the class. But really interested in getting on board these things in a little bit more detail. Like I say, doing 8 bikes today, in one day is always a sort of a tough ask, but it gave us a really good insight into the fact that these things are, should be really seriously considered for anybody who's out there in the market for an enduro bike.